Hello, my name's Barry Rooke. I'm the Executive Director of the National Campus and Community Radio Association. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to take a closer look at biases, what it is, how it shows up in election coverage, and how it affects the way we understand politics and make decisions as part of the AltElxn 2025 federal election coverage, brought to you by Covering Canada Election 2025 Fund. Personally, I'm a 40-year-old white cis male, middle class, living in Ottawa on the unceded territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. I grew up in a two-parent household in the city of Guelph, where my mother worked at the university, and my father was a stay-at-home dad for my sister and myself. I followed in their footsteps through university by taking broadcasting courses and eventually researched how social media was being used in radio in 2011 and 2012 for my master's. I rent, because who can afford to buy anything, and I live with my wife and two corgis, who you might hear in the background. I share this because who I am shapes how I see the world, how I hear stories, and how I make decisions. It shapes both my explicit biases, the things that I consciously believe or advocate for, and my implicit biases, the assumptions I carry without even realizing it. Explicitly, I believe in strong value of community media. I think our sector plays a vital role in the promotion of democratic expression and platforming underrepresented voices. That belief informs the work I do every day, and I don't shy away from sharing that. But I also have to confront my implicit biases, like gravitating towards people in similar communication styles, or unconsciously giving more weight to certain perspectives because they come from people who reflect my background or worldview. As a media advocate, a voter, and a broadcaster, I know that my perspective is shaped by my experiences, privilege, and sometimes blind spots. This episode isn't about pretending I'm going to be neutral. It's about asking questions, listening with intention, and creating space for a range of voices that often get left out. This segment is part of AltElxn 2025, a national collaboration between campus and community radio stations to bring diverse, accessible, and independent election coverage to the airwaves. In Canada, the regulated media landscape, which is traditional broadcast methods like radio and television, is shaped by the rules that are ultimately traced back to our elected officials. That's part of why this episode is full circle. Election coverage doesn't just reflect democracy, it is essential to keep it strong. One of the biggest recent shifts in Canadian broadcasting came through Bill C-11, also known as the Online Streaming Act, passed in 2023. It was a major update to the Broadcasting Act rules, the first one since the 1990s, and it aimed to modernize the streaming platforms and broadcasters operate in Canada, particularly around things like Canadian content, accessibility, and platform accountability. But laws like C-11 don't implement themselves. That's the job of the CRTC, the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission. The CRTC is the federally regulated body that oversees how broadcasters, not podcasters or newspapers at the moment, operate under Canadian law. So let's start with Bram Abramson, the Ontario Commissioner for the CRTC, about how the Commission views media trust, diversity, and the role of regulating during election. He starts by explaining the three pillars of broadcasting.
There's the public radio, or public broadcasting, I should say, whether it's radio, television, whatever. There's private, and then there's community media. And so, we oversee all three of those pillars. And I guess what I'll say, and perhaps contrary to what some might have the impression if they didn't know our work, is that really the way that we oversee those and regulate where necessary is what I'd call structural in nature. We tend to set out rules which ensure there will be hopefully a diversity of voices, of ownership, of sustainability as well, which is, I guess, at tension with the diversity of ownership sometimes. We tend not to wade much into content regulation. That tends to be more the role of codes of ethics, which of course we do approve. There will be a complaints body, whether it's an ombuds officer like the CBC has in public broadcasting, whether it's an arbitration or counsel, I suppose, as the private broadcasters have. But we do tend to try and avoid being hands-on in talking about content itself, simply because it's so fraught, and simply because freedom of expression is such an important value for us and for Canadians, which is why it's enshrined directly in the Broadcasting Act.
So how do media professionals learn to recognize and reduce biases in their reporting? What kind of training is there? And are there safeguards in place to support ethical storytelling in such a fast-moving and complex landscape, especially during an election?
My name is Andrew Mrozowski, and I am the president of the Canadian University Press, a cooperative of about 30 student newspapers from across Canada. The reason why I started in journalism was because I wanted to be able to share stories. I wanted to be able to tell people what was happening in their communities, whether it was local, whether it was municipal, federal, doesn't matter. We all want to be able to share stories that are factual, share the truth. Journalism is all about storytelling, but when it comes to telling that story, as the consumer, as the reader, as the listener, you still have to be aware and you still have to do some critical thinking. Journalism can get you 70% of the way. It'll provide you with the facts. It could illuminate a story that you never thought of, especially when it comes to a federal election like the one that we are about to go through. But at the end of the day, as a reader of a newspaper, as a listener of a podcast or a radio show, you still need to put in the work as well. We can't do everything for you. We can set you up for success, but at the end of the day, you have to take that and you have to make your own choices. You have to make your own opinions to determine where you think the truth is coming from. With my work with the Canadian University Press and then also with the student publication that I run at McMaster University, there's something that I always tell my staff. There's always three sides to every story. There's the person that you've interviewed on one side. So in this case, it could be a political leader. It could be a candidate. On the other side, there's other people that you have to talk to as well. The people who are impacted, the community members, the teachers, the nurses. But that third side, that is where journalism comes in. That third side is where you as a journalist have to reconcile. You have to go through between both sides of what is perceived as the truth and try to make sure that everything lines up. And that is where true journalism comes in. The training for journalism is really up to where you work. Everyone kind of has their own different way of approaching journalism, but the core fundamentals remain the same. You talk about how to conduct an interview. How do you do it in a non-biased way? Or if you know that there is going to be implicit bias, what are some safeguards that you can take to ensure that that will not come out in your final article? So as a journalist, you are constantly asking yourself, do I have a connection to this piece? If so, am I able to have an editor be there with me to make sure that I don't have that bias coming out? Are there different steps along that chain of the editing process to filter that out?
As media evolves, so does the way we train people to work with it. But in recent years, we've seen a troubling trend. Journalism and broadcasting programs are disappearing from campuses across Canada. A major factor in this shift is the reduction of international student enrollment, something that many programs relied on to remain financially viable. Yes, this is a political decision made at many levels of government that are forcing tough decisions to be made. In just the past year alone in Ontario, Fanshawe in London, Algonquin in Ottawa, Humber in Toronto, and Loyalist College in Belleville have announced the broadcast schools are closing. And when fewer people are being trained on how to tell stories responsibly, it becomes even more important that audiences know how to engage critically with what they hear.
Within this age of misinformation that we find ourselves in, especially as Canadians, a lot of people might be asking themselves, well, when I read an article, how do I make sure that there isn't bias? I would say to that, make sure that you're looking at reputable sources. Make sure that you're looking at sources that you know does their work. Outlets that spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in professional development for their staff, in training, to make sure that the stories that you are getting are the truth.
My name is Connie Thiessen. I'm the editor of Broadcast Dialogue, a trade publication focused on Canadian media and broadcasting, from radio and television to podcasting, film, and regulatory issues. Prior to taking this job in 2016, I worked in news radio for 2 decades in Vancouver, Edmonton, Halifax, and Manitoba. I think bias is incredibly dangerous, especially in a time of acute distrust in media. I know there has been a rising movement towards advocacy journalism, and I do think this does have a place, but not within the confines of a mainstream newsroom. I think this is where you have to exercise what I've come to term as the hammer of common sense. We're there to help people understand both sides of an issue, whether you agree or disagree with the politics of one side or the other. I think fact-checking has become a vitally important part of covering politics, and it puts the onus on us as journalists to be as informed as we can be. Read as much as you can. It will make you a better reporter, but as a news consumer, it will also give you a more discerning perspective. More than ever as a journalist, I'm very mindful not to add to the noise. I think we all have a level of digital overwhelm, and I think it's more important than ever to think about how we're telling stories and their value to the end user.
In my own exploration for ideas on this episode, I reached out through my social media accounts and asked people what they were most concerned about when it comes up to media biases. The responses were thoughtful, wide-ranging, and awfully deeply personal. One stood out a lot amongst the rest: ownership. So who runs our media, and how does our ownership shape what we hear, see, and trust? Connie continues.
Exploring the idea of following the money and how funding and advertising influence bias, I have experienced this over the course of my career, specifically the politics of station owners taking preference or dictating certain coverage choices. I've also seen stories get killed or downplayed based on the advertising power of a high-profile client. On the other hand, some newsrooms I've worked in have had distinct firewalls between the news and sales departments. I'm in the unique position now of being the editor of a trade publication, which is vendor-supported, and so there's much more of a delicate balance between advertorial and editorial, but we have policies in place to clearly identify our content to readers. I think if you find yourself in situations as a journalist where you think editorial standards are compromised, you should speak out and initiate a conversation. And if you don't get the resolve you're looking for, it might be time to look for a new opportunity. That is a very tough thing in the current media climate, but I think at the end of the day, our own individual personal integrity as journalists is really the best collateral we have to win the public trust back in media.
You're listening to the Alt-Election coverage brought to you by the National Campus and Community Radio Association. For more, check out AltElxN.ca.
My name is Alshahwany. I'm the Public Interest Articling Fellow at the Public Interest Advocacy Center, which is a consumer protection kind of based nonprofit and public interest advocacy group. We are a group of lawyers that fight for Canadians in all sorts of different niches, like telecommunications, in broadcasting, other aspects of life, like grocery stores, airlines, you name it. We've probably talked about it. That's a little bit about who I am. In terms of the topic today, I had a few ideas that I think kind of string together, but I think that all of these different factors, like following the money and audience targeting and the headlines, they're different parts of the jigsaw puzzle that can form either bias itself or the perception of bias in the reader. I'll start with the money because I think that that's kind of the most obvious one to me. I think that once you find out who owns the media company that you are consuming, it's almost like pulling back the curtain in The Wizard of Oz and you can't unsee it. You can't unsee that is the person kind of pulling the strings behind. The most kind of glaring example that is from our neighbors down south is Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post, which a few months ago, I think actually at the end of February, he kind of put out a memo to his staff saying that opinion pieces posted in the Washington Post kind of basically have to align with his political views, and which created a huge kind of uproar because people were like, well, that's not fair, but he owns it. So that's kind of how it works. Like, the ownership of the media company really matters. And in the Canadian context, I think this has kind of been almost weaponized. We see a lot of kind of seeds of distrust being planted against publicly funded media, which I think is a huge mistake. But basically saying like, well, the CBC, for example, is funded by the government. So no matter how distant they actually are from each other and how arm's length it kind of is, saying that, well, it's funded by the government and the government is a Liberal Party and has been for 10 years. So the CBC is just an extension of the Liberal government, which is kind of a few hoops further than maybe reality actually is. And to plant those seeds kind of from a major political party of distrust in public media, I think is very problematic.
Aya raises an important point. The perception that publicly funded media, like the CBC in Canada, is politically biased, simply because it receives funding from the government. It's a narrative that has been pushed hard in recent years and is one that risks undermining the trust Canadians place in some of the most essential media institutions. So what does trust actually look like in public media landscape today? What does impartiality mean when our attention spans are short and information is fragmented into 90-second clips? To explore these questions further, I spoke with Kristin Kozar and Harry Lock of the Public Media Alliance, a global organization that advocates for independent, trusted, and accountable public media.
I think also you have to consider it's a bit of a media literacy exercise. I think the pace in which and the amount of information that people are available is available to people now means it's harder than ever to actually get people to sit down and go, hang on, how do we trust news and why do we trust it? A lot of people still are looking for trusted news, but how they associate trust to the different sources is changing. So a lot of people are looking for more sort of, singular points of view, for example, candid voices and stuff like that. And that's trust for some people. I think the other thing is the conversation around due impartiality. So when they're thinking about CBC Radio Canada and other public media organizations, thinking about how is that organization not just impartial in everything it does, but across the day, across the spectrum of programming, for example, there's all of that to consider. And that's what a lot of that nuance has got very lost. And also people don't necessarily have the time to think about that as well. So there's an interesting set of things going on there.
I can't remember where I saw this, but I think so much of the problem is down to selective content consumption. So like if you are a public broadcaster, your linear schedule, where, as Kristin mentioned, so due impartiality. So you might represent a multitude of different voices across 24 hours or across a week, where you then do cover an issue in its full. But the problem is people aren't consuming those issues like that anymore. People are watching a 1 minute 30 video on X or on Instagram or wherever. Oh, sorry, probably not Instagram in Canada, but on what are the other ones? On TikTok maybe. And that's 1 minute 30 video might actually persuade them of the fact that CBC Radio Canada or any public broadcaster isn't impartial, because maybe that's 1.5 minute segment looking at one particular side of the conflict or one particular side of an issue. And so it just doesn't work. And it's actually quite confronting, because then it's like, wow, like the whole sort of basis of news distribution is quite challenged, I would say.
Yeah, there's an exact conversation I had with a student not so long back. I give seminars occasionally, and one student just put their hands up and said, "Yeah, you're making the BBC sound like an absolute saint. It's biased against Palestine." And I went, "Okay, there's probably lots of arguments as to why it could be biased against Palestine, but you have to, like, exactly what Harry said. I had to sort of stop and explain that." And then afterwards, it was sort of them going, "Oh, okay, yeah, I listened to 5 minutes this morning." But yeah. Because you probably aren't going to get, you're not always going to get someone from, the Israeli government speaking at the same time as someone from maybe representing Hamas or Hezbollah or whatever. It's a tough one.
Danse ni wagmagna gegwan ni totemtek. Eden FineDay netzigason. Nagi wachi giltsinia. Not dawi was FineDay egwa. Nigawi, Robin Rohatton. The traditional lands of the Hunkamunan-speaking peoples, Megwach, Niwegin. Hello, my relatives and friends. My name is Eden FineDay. I come from the Sweetgrass First Nation in Treaty 6 territory, and I'm speaking to you today from Tawasin, on the lands of the Hunkamunan-speaking peoples. I'm the publisher of IndigiNews and a co-founder of the Indigenous Media Association of Canada. Thank you for this opportunity to speak about the upcoming election. Regarding who I trust, I have to be honest, I don't trust our current political system. I do trust mainstream media institutions to report on the current political system. In my view, they were both born of the same worldview, so it would make sense that the media, mainstream media, can report on the current political system. But I don't trust a system where, in order to be elected to lead, you have to basically be popular. That doesn't make sense to me. In my culture, leadership wasn't about charisma or ambition. It was about worthiness. You had to prove that you were worthy of leading. You had to show that you had strong relationships in the spirit world, meaning that you were grounded in your spirituality. And then that would show outwardly as humility, wisdom, and a commitment to the people. But under this constitutional monarchy, what we have now is a popularity contest. And unfortunately, I just don't trust the integrity of the people who thrive in those systems. And consequently, the current governing system doesn't reflect my values or the values of a world that I would want to live in. I do trust the integrity of the women that I work with. I trust the integrity of the women I co-founded the Indigenous Media Association of Canada with. And I trust my team at IndigiNews because I see that they lead with humility, care, and integrity. They show up in ways that colonial systems just can't. And I see that they're guided by values that come from the land, from our ancestors, and from love. And by the way, not everyone on my team at IndigiNews is Indigenous, but they all share these values. They're guided by the values of the peoples of this land, and they respect Indigenous sovereignty, and they uphold the protocols of the First Nations with whom they work. So having said all that, I do still usually vote. I usually vote for the NDP, not because I think they're the best choice necessarily, but because I believe they're the closest that I can find to a party that shares my values in the current electoral system. You know, I heard someone say recently that we don't vote for candidates, we vote for parties. And I think that's true for me. But even that party that I vote for has also been a huge letdown to me. Because when it comes down to it, they also want to build pipelines and mines. And they need money from oil and gas and the mining sector. So there's only so much they're willing to listen to me or to us, the Indigenous people who speak on behalf of our communities and on behalf of the land. So the party platforms don't reflect my values. Even the so-called progressive ones, for me, are too far to the right. I live in a riding where a conservative is running for re-election. So casting a vote almost feels pointless because, you know, people might go from a conservative to a liberal, but it's pretty unlikely that they go from a conservative to the NDP. But I'll probably still vote. But it really does feel like having to choose between parties that all uphold the same status quo and perpetuate the same systemic harms. And I know I'm not alone in feeling like this. So when Indigenous people choose not to vote, it's not necessarily because of apathy. It could be due to insight into a system that doesn't work for us. Sometimes the choice not to vote comes from an understanding that this system was never built for us and that no amount of participation can make it a just system. So I'm not disengaged. I feel that I'm deeply engaged, but my energy is focused on the work I do because that's where I actually see change. I believe that humanity is in a battle that's been raging for centuries and right now is coming to a head. I think the earth is not well, and I think that when she shakes, erupts, or sends very strong winds, we will begin to understand as a species, we will begin to remember how powerful she is and how sacred she is. And we might start to understand that we've made a mistake when we took her for granted. And so I don't believe that any election necessarily can save us from the reckoning that we're about to undergo. So if you ask me who do I trust, I would say I trust the spirits with whom I have a relationship. I trust the earth. I trust the aunties and the amazing, powerful Indigenous women who lead their communities, raise the community's children, care for the elders and the young, and still do boss work in the community for the community. So I trust the ones who are quietly doing the work. And I don't believe that leadership is something that you can win. It's something you live. Egose. Hi. Gakiani Wagamaganak, all my relations.
As we wrap up, I want to thank all the voices who contributed to this conversation, from journalists to legal advocates to media analysts to Indigenous leaders. Their insights remind us that biases aren't always intentional, but it's always present, and how you can respond to those matters. One last piece of advice from Aya.
No journalist is going to be perfect. No author is perfect. There's going to be facts that are missing in pretty much every story that you read. And it's important to have a sense of doubt about the information that you're being given, because that can kind of help you spot misinformation. It can veer into the extremes where you are just like, this is all propaganda and none of this is real. And if you don't read what you like, people don't like to read things that tell them that they're wrong. People don't like to read things that challenge their ideas. This is just natural human tendency. If you read an article that goes against your ideas, you're going to be like, oh, is this for real? And go and check another article, another media outlet to see if it's legit. But at the same time, there's a line where it crosses into just conspiracy theories. My recommendation is and I do this every time I read a story that's just so far out of my scope of belief, I try to find other sources to see how they report on the same issue to help me form my own opinion.
Ownership, training, trust, perception, media fragmentation, and more. There's still so much we didn't get to, like the impacts of headlines and sensationalism, or how algorithmic curation shapes what we see in the first place. And of course, what could happen to us if the CBC was defunded? I will leave you with a task to try to figure out, to take a moment to critically analyze the media you consume. Who do you trust? Why do you trust them? And when was the last time you questioned that trust? Not to tear it down, but to better understand it. Media shapes democracy, and it's our engagement with it that shapes how strong or fragile that democracy becomes. This episode is part of the AltElxn 2025, a national collaboration bringing diverse voices and critical conversations to the airwaves ahead of Canada's next federal election. Don't forget to tune in to our live national election coverage on election night, and visit AltElxn.ca for interviews, resources, and station listings. A big thank you to our sponsors at Covering Canada Election 2025 Fund, made possible through the Public Policy Forum, the Rideau Hall Foundation, and the Michener Awards Foundation. I'm Barry Rooke. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you all on election night, April 28th.